Welcome to the Christ Connection Podcast. We are here to help and encourage you to enjoy your adventure with Jesus. I'm your host, Kevin Senapati Ratna. Let the journey begin. Well, welcome to the show. I hope you're feeling blessed today. Whatever it is that you're going through, God would be with you, and whether you feel aware of Him or not, He is. And so I hope you're encouraged by that today. My guest today is Mark Renfroe, and we get into his bio right at the beginning, but he's a guy with 25 years experience in the Muslim world, working there, missionary work some of the time, and he just has some wealth of experience to bring to the table. Now, you may be thinking, okay, I'm going to turn on to the next thing because I'm not called to the Muslim world, but hang with me. He's worked in one of the most difficult places in the world to be a Christian. And he talks about what it's like to deal with hardship. And whether you're working in the Muslim world or not, there is hardship that you're going to go through. And the wisdom that he brings and the perspective he brings is valuable for all of us. And no matter what our situation is and what we're going through. So hang with and listen to it, and I think you'll draw a lot of practical principles, but also just a framework to think about, because our goal is to draw close to Jesus. Our goal is to know Him, and no matter what our circumstances are. And just to be clear, there may be a tap on your shoulder at some point as you're listening to these podcast episodes, as we bring people from around the world, that at some point, God's going to tap you on the shoulder and say, hang on, listen a little closer. Maybe you need to take the next step with this. I'm believing that part of our calling as this podcast is to draw people into adventure with Jesus. And for some of you, that's going to be around the world. And so hang with, listen up, and I think you're going to be encouraged by that. One technical note, around 30 minutes in, there is a point for about 2 minutes where it kind of gets a little squeaky with the volume, but no, that's just 2 minutes, and I didn't want to cut it out because he was in the middle of an answer, and I think that was some good stuff there, so just hang with it for 2 minutes, and then it'll go away. Other than that, I hope you enjoy the show. So without further ado, my conversation with Mark Renfroe. Well, welcome to the show today. My guest today is Mark Renfroe. Mark has been a missionary, an organizational leader, and thought leader in the Middle East and Africa for 25 years. He loves the church in all shapes and sizes, and he longs to see Jesus glorified among every people group. He's married to Amy and have 4 great adult kids. He says they're great adult kids, so I'll take his word for that. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. Great to be here.
We've been Facebook friends for a while, but this is our first time actually seeing each other, and so it's great to be able to connect with you. Just to kind of give people a reference point. You've been at this, it says, for 25 years. What first kind of got you started in the world, thinking of overseas, because you're from the United States, from what I understand?
Yep, I grew up in the Atlanta area. When I was a boy growing up, Atlanta was not the ethnically diverse city it is today. It was African American and white. And those communities, even though I'm young enough that it wasn't, back during the segregation days or anything, but there was still an unspoken sort of segregation. And so, the African American community lived in a particular part of town. I wasn't raised around any sort of racist type thought, but I still, saw that lived out. And so, my life growing up as a child was pretty simple as it related to the world. There wasn't a whole lot of world around me. And so, of course, today, Atlanta is 4.5 million people, and it's got people from all over the world. There's parts of town you go into, and the Bank America sign is in Korean, and so, that shows you how our world has changed so much. But in my childhood, it wasn't like that. And so, I grew up in the church. My father was a pastor. He's retired now. good man. He was actually a pioneer church planter, and so he planted churches. And for missionaries in our organization, what they would do is they'd pick up the phone, they'd call a pastor, and they'd say, "Hey, Pastor Renfroe, can I come to your church, share the burden about what God's put in our heart, sort of thing," and trying to raise support. And my dad was kind of like the absolute dream for every missionary, because what he would always say was good for them and not always great for the church. And here's why. They would call and they would say, what, like to come? And he'd say, "Look, we're a small church, don't have a huge amount of people. You need to go somewhere where you can make more, have a better offering. You can get more support." He goes, "This is what I'll do, though. If you'll send me a pledge form, we'll make a pledge and we'll give you an offering.
Wow.
And you don't have to come here." And so, he had a real missions heart. When he retired, his church was giving 33% of their budget away to missions, to world missions. So it kind of shows where his heart was. The downside of that was that the church was not exposed to missionaries. And so growing up, I had this kind of like unrealistic idea of what missions was. I kind of had this idea that, missionaries walked about 3 feet off the ground. Not necessarily that they were holy, but they were just other. They were something other than what I was. And unfortunately, I went through a period of almost 10 years where I was away from the Lord. And so in that time, I had taken on a career, and I was in, kind of just what Bill Bright used to call a happy pagan. And the Lord kind of, even in that process, was moving me, kind of directing me, closing doors, opening doors, giving me a little bit of success, kind of what I thought I wanted. And so enough of it so that I saw just how empty it was. And so in that process, I ended up coming back to the Lord. And within a couple of years, I actually had this weird thing happening. I started feeling like God was calling me into ministry. And the reason that was weird for me was because while I loved my parents and I loved, the church setting that I grew up in, all of that, I didn't really love the local church. and you got to, like I said, my parents were church planners. And so imagine, you're a 13-year-old, your parents are planning a church, and you're the only person in the Sunday school with your mother. That wasn't exactly, the most exciting, today church planning is cool.
Right.
And you go out in teams, and, I love the approach today. I really love it. But back then it was like, "Hey, brother, you go for it," and there was no support. And, so the positive side of that is, man, I learned work ethic from my parents. I learned what it meant to work hard, to pray hard, to pastor people. I learned so many things from that. But I also learned that, it could be done better and more effective if we did it together. The body of Christ has all of these gifts, and we're not meant to be Lone Rangers. And so, years later, that would even impact how we did missions. So all of that relates, a friend of mine used to say, still says, wherever we go in life, we take our baggage with us.
Right.
And so that's kind of my baggage. I bring it in for good or for bad. And so felt God was calling me to ministry, went to college to prepare for that, thought I would be a pastor because that's all I knew. Call to ministry had
Right.
to equal pastoral ministry because that's what I knew. And I was expecting to go into that, was excited about it, and was working hard, studying, and actually ran for student body president at the school I was at, and got beat. I didn't. And but what's interesting is how these kind of failures happened. I mean, I don't know how big. That's not like a world-class failure or anything, but still, out of that, what happened is a friend came up to me later on, and just a couple weeks later, and said, "Hey, I heard when you were running, I listened to what you had to say, those kind of things. It's clear you have a gift of leadership. Would you be interested in leading a missions convention that we have here at the school every year?" I don't know if you've ever heard of Urbana. Yeah. Urbana is this massive intervarsity Christian fellowship event. And so what it happens every 3 years. And on the 2 off years, I don't know if they still do it, but they used to do regional conferences.
Oh, really? Okay.
And so the regional conference for the Southeast was actually in Florida, where I was going to school, and it was actually hosted at the school I was attending. And so they asked me if I would be interested in leading that conference, and my response was, "Why are you asking me? I'm not interested. I'm not going to be a missionary." And and of course I think God chuckled, but at the same time, eventually I said yes. I'm not even sure I said yes for the right motivation, you know.
Right.
But God's so much bigger than that, and He works in and through us, and sometimes in spite of us. And so I said yes in that process because I did believe in doing what I was going to do with excellence. I started learning about the world. I started reading, started interfacing with missionaries, and it was the first time I ever heard of the concept of the 1040 window. That was pre unreached people group,
Right.
foci like we have today. And so I started learning about the 1040 window, and I learned that, over 90% of the world's unreached people groups lived in this piece of geography, and yet only 2% of missionaries and 2% of money went toward reaching them. And before I had gone to Bible college, I was actually in business, and I still today tend to look at a lot of things from the perspective of business. And I just remember thinking, why in the world would you build a restaurant right next to 10 other restaurants when there's a section of town where it's totally underserved and people are hungry? And so I realized there's a little bit of a flaw in the logic there, but what God did in my mind was that was the shift from me planning a church or pastoring in America to going to the unreached. And I started praying and just being open. And one evening I had gone to the library and had pulled a magazine off the shelf. It's not published anymore. It was published by the U.S. Center for World Missions. It was called World Christian Magazine, and I took it out, and there were two ads in the magazine as I was flipping through it, and I can still see them in my mind today. They were black background, white ink, very, very stark. They were by an organization that serves amongst Muslims, and one of them said 32,000 Muslims died and went to hell yesterday, and you probably don't care.
Wow.
And the other one said, ignorance isn't bliss, it's hell.
Wow.
And I went home that night and I volunteered. That was my call. There was no lightning, there was no thunder, no voices. It was this perfect storm of the condition of the world, the condition of my heart, and what I believed Scripture taught about the condition of the lost.
Did you then right away jump into something, or was it still a while for that process to develop?
Yeah, I was still in college, needed to finish my degree, and was working really hard. And so didn't really have a plan on where that was going to be. I knew it was going to be in the Muslim world, but the Muslim world's pretty diverse. It goes from, Indonesia with, largest Muslim country in the world to, of course, what people think of the Muslim world, the Arab world, to, many other representations of Muslims around the world. And so for me, I was just praying about Muslims, and I'd use Operation World, and I'd pray through the world, but I'd particularly pray for those Muslim countries that I came across. And then I met this amazing lady named Amy, and interesting. We had an interesting conversation. We knew of each other, sort of thing. It was a relatively small campus, about 1,200 students, and so we had. I knew her well enough to say hello, but not enough to actually have a conversation. And one night we actually ran into each other in the library. Not enough chairs. Ended up sitting at the same table, and had a 3 hour conversation. I went home and told my roommate I met the girl I'm going to marry,
Wow.
and she, which was a big deal for me. I mean, I knew guys who did that every week, but for me, it was the first time it ever happened. And interestingly enough, I found out later she'd actually gone home and told her roommates the same thing,
Wow.
that she'd met the guy she was going to marry, and she had a call specifically to the Arab world. And one thing that was important to me was because I knew that there was some cost associated with Muslim ministry. I felt very strongly that whoever I married, they needed to have a call related to the Muslim world that was independent of mine. There's a lot of ways couples wind up on the field, and there's not one way that's right or one way that's wrong, but for me, that was important. And Amy's call is just as real as mine. And so I think the Lord actually I know the Lord used Amy to sort of refine my call from Muslims in general down specifically to the Arab world. And that was our focus for over 20 years. We started out working with Arabs in San Francisco, California, with our home missions department of our organization. And then we moved overseas, went to Egypt for a couple of years, and then spent 20 years in Amman, Jordan.
Wow. So you said you grew up in this environment where you didn't get to interact a lot with missionaries. When you finally then became one, was that a weird adjustment for you then? Or by that point you had kind of gone through enough of the, seen enough and interacted with enough that it wasn't that big of a deal?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I had been around enough of them that I knew that they were just normal, ordinary people. There are missionaries that are really off the charts, high capacity, and then there are missionaries that are much lower capacity, just like human beings. There are missionaries who, of all different personality types in today's world, there are missionaries with all different sorts of training and backgrounds. And so I think by the time I arrived on the field, I realized that they weren't as other as I had first suspected. And so, I learned that missionaries had struggles with their marriages, and they had struggles with their children, and they love their countries at times in theory, and then at times, the driving is enough to make them want to, swear. And they're normal, ordinary people, and that most of them deeply love Jesus, and they want to see the part of the world that they live in impacted for Him and the peoples there. And one of the things I probably would note is that even though there are lots of personality types in those who work in missions, I have noticed that God does not seem to call weak-willed people. And I mean, it does take something to leave family, friends, the known for the unknown, to leave family. And, so that's probably the one commonality that people tend to have.
When you say weak-willed, is that something that's kind of a learned thing that you've noticed, or is that something that's a God-given characteristic that's where they're?
Yeah. I think it's that sort of personality DNA that's hardwired inside of us that can either be our strength or our weakness, and most of the time it's both. It takes a lot of determination to do this, to leave family and friends and the known for the unknown. And at the same time, we hold on to this vision that God gave us, which is individual and singular and very personal. Then we go overseas and we have to work with missionaries, all of whom have had the exact same type of experience, but different. And so all of a sudden we have to mold our multiple visions to work together. mission service in an organization is very, it's similar to, and then at the same time very unlike churches being in the same city. A pastor in a good pastor in a local congregation wants to see every church in his community do well. Um, However, he doesn't have to work with every other pastor
Right.
in the city.
Right.
You know, missionaries, depending on their context, oftentimes find themselves having to work pretty closely with other missionaries. And so that tends to bring out the best in us and occasionally the worst in us.
Right. And working in the
Let me just add one thing to that. I think what missions has done. I mean, by God's grace, I hope and think we've done a few things that were of value to the kingdom. But probably the biggest transformation that's happened in our missions experience is the journey my own heart has gone on. A softening, a holding on more tenaciously to Jesus, and a relinquishment of so much of other.
Do you see that as kind of the 25 years of kind of grinding it out? That's you have to have that in order to, especially in the Arab world, or
No, I think that's a personal choice of how we deal with what comes into our lives. One of the Spurgeon said, "The same sun that melts the wax hardens the clay." And we all will deal with hardship in our lives. And I was talking to my daughter recently, and last few years have been pretty tough for some things in our family. And I said something, and my daughter said, "Baba," which is the Arabic word for like daddy. She goes, "Baba, you have become soft in your old age." And I said, "No, I've chosen softness." I said, "I've had enough happen that I could be hard if I wanted to, but I've chosen softness." And I think that's what the Lord wants of us. And so I think it's how we respond to allow the sun of God's refining fire heat to make us soft and not make us hard.
Is any advice, because you're correct, that anyone, no matter their context, is going to have the struggles of life that are, you're pastor in a small town church, you're a single mother. Well, I mean, even in my own context, my wife has been in and out of the hospital the last 2 weeks. So, I mean, there's a pressure of life that just kind of comes on. Any advice to someone who's maybe in the midst of that so that they don't choose hardness over the softness? Is there anything that's helped you through that process that comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, none of it that's really revolutionary. Most of us know what to do. It's just really hard to do it. It's pray a lot. Talk to God. And, I tend to be rather loquacious. I like to talk. And, it's the temptation is to talk to people instead of talk to God. To pray, to listen, to spend time in His Word, to have a few good friends that you can trust. Those kind of people that you can tell, you can say anything to. They're not going to judge you, but at the end of the day, they're going to say, they're going to speak lovingly into your life. And, I think it's a lot of it is also just being willing to be honest with yourself. I love the Psalms because of the writer's transparency. David and the other writers of the Psalms are so incredibly transparent with God. they we find that if we speak to God about our situations, we don't tend to act out. But what I've noticed is when that people talk to man about their situations, they tend to act out. And so I think just keeping that before the Lord, and understanding that the Lord can handle my anger. I mean, I know this sounds probably close to blasphemous, but sometimes I feel like, and I'm still having to wrestle through this one. So, it's one of those that, you know, anything on the internet lives forever. But, you know, there's an element of which we almost have to forgive God. What I mean, not that obviously God doesn't do anything that deserves forgiveness. We get that. He's pure, he's holy. There's not an ounce of darkness in him. But when we're going through times of hardship, we sense, or maybe I should say, we don't sense his presence. Right. I can remember one day being so hurt, so angry, so the weight of life was so heavy. And this was in the midst of us, me trying to lead what was, the work of our organization in 18 countries. And, there's this daily weight related to that. And I remember saying to God, I know from the scriptures that you are a good father. But right now, as your child, I feel like I could bring you up on child abuse charges. Because that's what I felt.
Right.
Now, who was right? God or me? Of course. God. But the amazing thing is that God wasn't moved by that.
Right.
He didn't smite me. He didn't punish me. I was talking to God about that. I wasn't talking to others. I wasn't, demeaning his name, as the psalmist said, amongst the peoples. I was talking to him, and he helped me understand, that pain that I was experiencing was valuable. It was producing in me, a hope that wouldn't fade away. And it was softening my character. Man, was it helping me to be more sympathetic with those who, were hurting, to realize that things come into our life sometimes that we were the cause of, and sometimes a lot of times things come into our life that we didn't have anything to do with. It just happened. I'm always, we read the book of Job, and I don't know if we enjoy it, but the thing I'm always amazed by is that Job didn't have Job.
Right. That's so true.
We read in Job 1 why this whole thing happened. Job didn't have that. Job just had to live with the pain of the circumstances. And so the benefit of that is that when we are walking through difficult times and things are happening, we can at least know that there is an unseen realm that has causation behind what's happening in our life. And if we live surrendered to God, he will use it for his glory and for our good. I think that's the tension that most of us fail in. We believe that God will use it for his glory. We're just not sure he's going to use it for our good.
Well, I was talking to my daughter about this topic in the last couple of weeks, and one of the things that you realize is, like Job, he didn't know the end of the story. I mean, he didn't even necessarily, we don't know that he knew all that was going on behind the scenes. He was just going through that moment, and when we're in that moment, to come to God with all honesty and say, this stinks and doesn't make sense. Why are you doing this? You could fix this in a moment. And he's not doing what we want him to do. So I love that idea, what you're saying, just coming with complete candor, and like he doesn't know anyways what we're feeling on the inside. We're fooling him by trying to be pious about it when he knows our emotions. So bring it to him and be honest about it.
Yeah, and understanding it, there's this element of, obviously, I think I have a high view of God and His sovereignty, and so when something like this something bad comes into my life, at least something that I perceive as bad, comes into my life, I have to acknowledge that while God may not have caused it, He chose to spread His fingers out wide enough to allow this to come through His loving hands. Because He had the power to stop it.
Right.
I can't believe in an all-powerful God who somehow, we are not dualist, that God and Satan are at equal here, and, we're not sure who's going to. So when something comes into our life that is evil, and, whether it be, the brokenness of our bodies, seeing abuse that happens in our world, or the lostness of mankind, the people groups that have never been exposed to the glory of Jesus through the gospel of Christ. All of those things, I think for us, are gateways for us to test our understanding of what the psalmist said: you are good and you are powerful. I've lived in kingdoms, true monarchies. They used to, the local people used to talk about the difference between, I lived in Jordan for many years, where the original king was King Hussein, or when we first got there. And right next door in Iraq, we had Saddam Hussein. Both were absolute monarchs. One was benevolent and one was evil. And so to understand that God is this truly benevolent monarch, that He has all power and all sovereignty, but He's also good. I think coming out of it with that helps us through all of life.
Do you think? No, go ahead.
I just say multiply that, put that application into someone serving on the mission field, who is suffering for the sake of the gospel, or even more often seeing people around him who have come to Christ in an unreached context suffer for their faith. If you haven't wrestled through that one on a personal level, you don't have the ability to lead God's people.
Well, that was actually where I was going to ask you. I mean, being in those, I don't know if tough surroundings to do missions work, you do really have to wrestle with some of that, I suppose, more so than maybe suburban, mega church type context.
Yeah, I have discovered through the years there's no place where ministry is easy. It just has different battles. It has different dragons. And so, I have a real burden for small town America. The opioid crisis and the things that are happening in our country today are devastating our nation. I look at our cities and see incredible need there, and great potential and opportunity. I look at our universities. So many places where ministry is taking place, and so much need is present. They have equal but different battles. Those who are involved in ministry there must fight. The difference is, I think, that the weight of cross-cultural living amplifies the struggle. So I'm living in amongst an unreached people group. Just daily existence turns the stress level up. By a factor of a couple of hundred. And then all of this other stuff is happening also. And complicated on that, you know, you live in an American context that's got so much need for the gospel, but very few people in America who come to Christ are really going to pay a price for their faith. Yes, if a Muslim here on the university campus near where I live comes to faith in Christ, he's probably going to be rejected, but by his family. But the average American comes to Christ. His parents, his friends may not understand him. There may be some ridicule. There may be other forms of ostracism, but he's not worried about whether or not someone's going to take his life because he came to Christ. Go to an unreached people group context, and the people groups that are left that haven't been evangelized, there's a reason they haven't been evangelized. They're hard. If it was easy, and somebody else would have already done it. And so you're there, you're working in that kind of context, and God is trying to help you help them, because let's just be honest. God's not going to give me the opportunity to lead an emerging church where people are going to pay dearly for their faith without allowing me to suffer. I got nothing to offer. Oh yeah, I remember that one time, when, I had a flat tire and I was late for a meeting, that's not exactly suffering. God's going to give us the opportunity to suffer, and I say to put calluses on our knees and steel in our spines, so that we can be the one another for those people who are going through hardship related to their conversion experience.
How has ministry in that part of the world, 25 years, has it? Have you seen markings of things changing in a certain way, or requiring a different type of missionary to come in, or is it a lot of the same issues, 25 years later?
Yeah, I don't think that anything has changed as far as the type of missionary. I think that's needed. I think what has changed a little bit is that we are moving more and more to a team approach versus the more Lone Ranger approach of the earlier days. And so a team approach opens up a door, particularly in what would typically be referred to as closed country context. It gives us the opportunity to come in with maybe secular degrees, where we can come in and we can do things that allow us to stay in the country, that add value to the country. But the most important thing, and the reason I said the type of missionary hasn't really changed, is that whether you're a doctor, an engineer, a school teacher, you still need to have the heart of an apostle. So your skill set secondary to the condition and the calling of your heart.
So when you use the term heart of an apostle, what does that mean? How would you describe that?
That your heart burns for Jesus and your heart burns for the lost. In the context that you're in, and you're willing. I mean, what does Paul talk about is the mark of his apostleship? The church planted and the suffering that he's endured.
Hey. If people are looking at praying for that part of the world, what are kind of the high points of what's going on now? I mean, not necessarily specific, country thing, but just kind of general praying for missionaries in that part of the world. Any recommendations there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, whenever you're praying for missionaries, just keep in mind missionaries are ordinary people. And so, they have their own struggles. They're dealing with things with their families and everything. And so I think the thing is that, pray that their walk with the Lord will stay strong, and that the main thing will always stay the main thing, and the main thing contrary to what people might think, is actually not the mission. The main thing is Jesus. Jesus stays number one. Everything else tends to fall in line.
That is, Jesus is the answer, right?
Yeah, not just for the world, but for us. And so, staying close to Jesus, developing a daily pattern of listening to the voice of the Spirit, instant obedience. I'd rather obey quickly and be wrong than hesitate, on like this constant, well, was that God? Was that not God? The Father is such a good Father that he's not going to let me walk off the end of a pier. He's there guiding me. And so, even if I, in my zeal, head off in the wrong direction, I think if I'm sensitive and I'm listening, the Lord will pull me back. He'll help guide me on a daily basis. So just pray for their, devotional life, their families. That it's family life that tends to be the area that the enemy attacks the most in missionaries. I told my wife years ago, I said, honey, if everything is okay at home, I can face anything in the world. But if things are rocky here, I don't really care how great things are going outside my house. This is what's important to me. And so just making sure those things are, so pray for that. Pray for, we are seeing some pretty unprecedented people movements in some isolated places in the Muslim world. I wish it was broad, and I wish I could say, there were, all across the Muslim world, people are coming to faith in Christ by scores. And that, unfortunately, that's not the case. But we are seeing places where there are some radical, amazing growth in the local church. Local church means, it's a house church context. Right. But where we used to talk about, dozens of people coming to faith in Christ, and we would rejoice in those. Those were large numbers. Today we're literally talking about thousands of people coming to Christ. Wow. We're talking about, hundreds, if not thousands, of small house church context in one particular country, and all of this within the last 10 years. And wow. And yet I have to, at the same time, for the sake of transparency, put in the component of, and over the last 18 months, 13 martyrdoms. So there's always a price paid in these pioneer contexts, particularly by local believers. So pray for the underground church, pray for the suffering church. And then, of course, pray for where the church is not. In the Muslim world, there's still more people groups that are not engaged with the gospel than there are people groups that are engaged. Wow. And so, pray that people will hear God's voice, that they will respond in obedience, that the church will have a heart for the Muslim world. And so, this is it's a tough time to be when I say pro-Muslim, I'm talking about from a spiritual context, obviously. We live in a world that loves to make, enemies, right. Where somebody's the cowboy and somebody's the, and so we look at that, and that's not a healthy way. It's not a kingdom way of looking at the world. Mark Twain used to say, it's not the parts of Scripture I don't understand that give me problems. It's the parts I do understand. Like the forgiving and loving my enemies. Right. And so even if you think the Muslim world is your enemy, you have clear mandate from Scripture on how to deal with that one.
That's good.
Pray for, forgive, and serve.
Right. if someone was listening to this and kind of just even this conversation started to stir something in their heart, like whether, they're not sure if it's something that God would have them do, but it might be something. Do you have any advice, kind of a pathway or thought process of how to process that?
Yeah, I oftentimes use the analogy of, if God, like I think it's what you just described, if God taps you on the shoulder, it's the what's next. It's not usually God taps you on the shoulder, hey, I want you to spend the rest of your life serving amongst the X of X. That's not generally how God's will is revealed. Eugene Peterson called it a long obedience in the same direction. I think it's that. I think it's God taps us on the shoulder and we respond in obedience, and he gives us a little bit more light and a little bit more light and a little bit more light. So, yes, I think if you were one, I would say, obviously, know the hope, know the reason for the hope that's within you. So, going to the unreached, sharing your testimony isn't enough. You actually have to know your Bible. You have to know it well. And so, spend time in the Word. Burden is usually built on information. And so there's lots of resources today, things like the Joshua Project, you can go to online. Operation World, you can go to online, or you can buy the physical book. These are tools that allow you to go through and pray. Form a relationship with, today digitally, with one or two missionaries that are serving in amongst the unreached. Maybe God would want you to serve with them, or maybe God just wants to give you an opportunity to kind of learn from them. Go on a short-term missions trip. In an unreached context. So, I have nothing against people going to places where the church is already present. That's outside of my sphere of control and mostly outside of my sphere of influence. But I do think that there is value in going to places where the gospel isn't present and allowing God to work. So go to an Istanbul, or an Amman, or a Muscat, or here's my thing I do. Kevin, I'm going to give you $20 if you can tell me the capital of Mauritania.
I'm out.
Yeah, exactly. Join me on a short-term missions trip of that's just to be a prayer trip to Nouakchott, Mauritania. Nouakchott, Mauritania. Operation World describes Mauritania as perhaps the most spiritual needy country in the Muslim world.
Wow.
So that's like saying it's the darkest corner of the dark room.
Wow.
And so, go and turn your cell phone off and, disengage from influence other than Jesus and let God wreck your life for those local people and, then follow in obedience for what he says.
That's some amazing advice there. Highlight two things there. First of all, Operation World. If you're listening to this, episode 4, I believe it is, we had Jason from Operation World on, so you can go back and listen to all his resources there. And for me personally, going on a vision trip to the Muslim world was very eye-opening for me, and I'm I'm a missionary kid, so I've grown up in that, but still, it wasn't a Muslim country, but I grew up there, in that context, but still going to something outside of my comfort zone was powerful. It looks like our time is slipping away, and I haven't got through lots of my questions. But I guess maybe we'll have to do a round two at some point. I've loved this conversation. Before we do, though, take off, is there any ask or some kind of direction that you would like to encourage the audience? Just promote something. I don't care anything before we take off. You'd like to leave with the audience?
Yeah, there is. And it's a challenge that I leave where a lot of times where places where I'm going. I'm so concerned that so many Christians spend their life on the trivial. I'm not so worried about Christians spending their life on the sinful.
Wow.
I'm worried about them spending their life on the trivial, on what really makes no eternal difference. And that doesn't really have to do with location. Yes, I believe that as we really listen to the voice of God, I do believe he'll bring circumstances, he'll bring opportunities into our life that allow us, maybe even guide us into places like I talked about earlier, the city, the small town America, the university campus, or maybe the unreached. But that we would live our life for significance, for godly significance, to listen to the voice of God, and to seek his glory and nothing else. That today in my life, I'm 56 years old, and I think that if you ask me the one thing I'd learned in 27 years of doing missions work, it's the absolute, I want to say awesomeness, and that word's so cheapened, but the awesomeness of God's glory. And I want him glorified in my daily life. I want him glorified in my family. I want him glorified in my habits. I want him glorified amongst every people group. My wife has a part-time job here in town, and she works for a mental health provider, and she has a degree in that field. And she has a woman in her office that has great competency. She spent the last decades living her life in a very debauched type of lifestyle. The kind of lifestyle that people look at and they go, oh, those kind of people don't get saved. Like their sin is attached to their identity. They just don't get saved. And last Sunday, we were getting ready to go out of town for a long trip. And she calls on Saturday night. And my wife's been she didn't lead her to the Lord, but she's been sort of discipling her. And she called her on Saturday night. And she said, hey, I'm getting baptized tomorrow. Would you come? And so we went, and of course we were there, and a few other believers from my wife's workplace were there and cheering her on. And then a couple days ago, she said to my wife, she's in her early 60s now. She said, I pursued all this for my whole life, and she goes, for the first time in my life, I'm happy. That's the power of the gospel, Kevin. And God wants that for every people group on the planet. And it's time for the church to stop just looking for the low-hanging fruit. To whether it's, going to the LBGT community in America, or the university campus, or the strident evangelistic atheist that exists in our society today, or if it's going to the Muslim, the Buddhist, or the Hindu world. That the location is God's determination. The submission is ours. And the understanding that submission is actually the pathway to joy. People have this view of, walking with the Lord and, living in obedience, that it's some sort of like Jonah complex. and nothing could be true, you know, living in resistance to God's will is what causes frustration and angst. Living in submission to God may not be the easiest thing you've ever done in your life, but it can be the most joyful thing you've ever done.
That's a wonderful place to end. I would like to pray for you before we can jump off here, and then again, thanks so much for being on. This has been great. Lord, I pray for Mark right now. I thank you for your heart for him, your calling upon his life, how you've used him. And as he even talked about praying for those in this work, we pray for him right now. I pray for his family as they're spread out around the globe. I pray that you would bless them, his kids, that they would know your presence in a new and fresh way today. Lord, I pray for his wife as she travels, Lord, that you would give her safety and give her joy. May their relationship grow and develop like never before. Lord, and then as I close, I pray for our hearts, that we would be sensitive to your leading and your guiding. Lord, that we would be open to whatever you call us to, whether it's around the world or across the street, that we would be lifting you up, and that we would know you more every single day. We really want to know you. So guide us in that, God. I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Again, thanks, Mark, for being on the show. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's a joy.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Mark. It was blessed by his heart and his passion for Jesus. I hope that it draws you into a new adventure with Jesus, even if it's just after you shut this off, take 15 minutes and just say, Jesus, I want to know you more. Grab a verse of Scripture and just let that be your prayer and just talk to Jesus about it for a while. If you do that, then this podcast has been a win, because our desire is for you to go in a new place and a new adventure with Jesus, whatever that it looks like for you, whether it's right at the beginning of your walk with God or you've been walking with Jesus for 40 years, he still wants more of you and wants you to know his heart and beat with the heart that he has. So again, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you're looking for the show notes, come on over to christconnection.cc /podcast, and that will be where the show notes are at. You can find out information there. We'd love to hear from you. If you're on social media, why don't you go over to either Christ Connection on Facebook or Enjoying Prayer on Twitter. We're there, and just say hi and let us know that you're listening, or maybe you're a business owner and you're looking at you'd love to sponsor this podcast. We're just in the early stages of that process, and so why don't you again say hi on social, and we'll start the conversation there. But again, our purpose with this is for you to walk with Jesus at a new place, so I hope you do that. So stop on over to christconnection.cc. We have all sorts of resources to help you with that journey. But until next time, thanks for listening.